In 1967, Harlem Bumpy Johnson ended a brotherhood by sliding one envelope across a table at Small's Paradise. Inside were 3 photographs and a 48-hour deadline that erased Frank Lucas from Harlem without a single gun drawn. This wasn't anger or betrayal, but a deliberate act of control. One man chose principle over blood. So what did Bumpy do that night that reshaped power forever? To understand it, the story must return to where loyalty first cracked. October 17, 1967. 10:34 in the evening. Small's Paradise, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson sits across from Frank Lucas in the private room above the club. Duke Ellington plays below. A glass of cognac sits untouched between them. Bumpy's hands rest flat on the mahogany table with the stillness of a surgeon who has already decided which organ must be removed. Frank's hands will not stop shaking. Something in the air tastes like the moment before a blade opens flesh. Bumpy slides a manila envelope across the table. The sound of paper on wood carries more weight than any threat. Frank stares at it but does not touch it. Open it. Frank's fingers fumble with the clasp. 3 photographs spill onto the table. First photo, Saigon. Leslie Atkinson beside a military truck. Wooden crates marked with red crosses. Second photo, Bangkok warehouse. Same crates opened, not medical supplies. Packages wrapped in plastic, money being counted. Third photo, Bronx funeral home. Coffins in rows. One opened showing packages, not a body. Men transferring them to bags. Frank recognizes 2 men he recruited 3 months ago. Frank's face drains to corpse color. I have known for 3 months. Bumpy's voice stays flat. Surgical. 3 months watching you build operations you believed I could not see. Frank's throat closes. You were taught one principle above all others. Harlem does not touch heroin. Bumpy leans forward. That was not suggestion. That was foundation. The reason Harlem trusts me. The reason I can walk these streets without guards. I kept it outside Harlem, Frank says. His voice breaks. I never brought it into the neighborhood. You kept geography while violating spirit. You believed you could profit from poison elsewhere while maintaining clean hands here. Bumpy's eyes hold January river temperature. But the money you made destroying lives in the Bronx still flows back here. Still corrupts. Still proves principle means nothing when profit calls. Silence stretches like razor wire pulled tight. You built this on coffins, Frank. Literal coffins. Dead soldiers coming home from Vietnam. You carved out their organs and filled cavities with heroin packages. You turned American casualties into your supply chain. Frank's stomach turns, hearing it spoken aloud. Leslie Atkinson coordinates in Thailand, pays military transport officers to look away, pays morticians to prepare bodies for dual purpose, 16 people on payroll across 3 countries, 40 kilograms monthly, $500,000 weekly. Bumpy's voice never rises. I know all of it because I have people inside your operation reporting to me before reporting to you. Frank jerks upright. Who? Does not matter. What matters is you violated the one principle I would kill to protect. Bumpy's jaw tightens. Harlem does not touch heroin. You touched it. You built empire on it. You proved everything I taught you about power and principle meant nothing measured against your ambition. The words cut deeper than any blade. You have 48 hours. Bumpy's voice drops to a whisper that carries more menace than shouting. Shut down every operation, sever every connection, walk away from everything you built, then leave Harlem. The sentence lands like bullets at point-blank range. Leave Harlem, Frank's voice cracks. This is my home. You brought me here. You made me what I am. I made you something you chose to unmake. Bumpy stands. 48 hours. You walk away, or I dismantle everything myself. When I dismantle operations, I do not leave survivors to rebuild. I leave bodies in positions that ensure no one else makes similar mistakes. I leave warnings carved into flesh. You are choosing him over me after everything we built together. I am choosing principle over blood, choosing Harlem over profit, choosing to cut out infection before it spreads and kills everything I spent 40 years protecting. Bumpy walks to the door, stops, turns back. You were my student, my protege, the man I believed would carry forward what I built. But you chose money over meaning, empire over principle, your ambition over my legacy. He opens the door. 48 hours. Frank, if you are still in Harlem after that deadline, what happens next will not be conversation. It will be demonstration of what happens to men who betray everything they were trusted to protect. I will find everyone in your operation. I will break bones until they tell me where product is stored. I will burn warehouses. I will put bullets in kneecaps of every man who worked for you. I will make your empire collapse so thoroughly that mentioning your name becomes career suicide. This story is reconstructed from historical accounts and documented testimony. The purpose is historical examination of power dynamics, not endorsement of criminal methodology. Bumpy leaves, the door closes. Frank sits alone with 3 photographs in 48 hours to disappear from the only home he has known. The man who walked in as heir apparent now understands he is being erased completely. Not through violence, through something more devastating. Disappointment from the one person whose approval mattered more than money or power or empire. Outside, Harlem continues its night rhythms. Music plays, people laugh, life moves forward. But upstairs in that amber-lit room, Frank Lucas sits, frozen understanding that the countdown has begun, and when it ends, his name will be spoken in Harlem only as warning about what happens when students betray teachers and ambition drowns principle. 48 hours. Then exile. Then silence. Then history recording that Frank Lucas built an empire on coffins and lost everything the moment Bumpy Johnson slid 3 photographs across a table and proved that real power comes not from what you can take, but from what you refuse to compromise even when profit screams louder than principle. In 1961, Frank stepped off the Greensboro bus with $40 and a murder warrant. He killed a Klansman who burned crosses and terrorized black families, put a bullet through the man's skull at point-blank range, and watched him drop in front of his own burning cross. The murder made him fugitive down south, but commodity in Harlem, where men who understood violence without losing themselves to it were valuable. Bumpy heard about Frank through channels that carried information faster than buses carried refugees. A young man who killed with precision rather than passion, who understood violence was tool, not identity. 3 days later, Bumpy arranged a meeting at the Palm Cafe. He watched Frank scan exit's note positions, settle into a chair with his back to the wall. You killed a Klansman. He burned churches, terrorized families. Someone needed to stop him. Frank's voice stayed flat. You understand that killing him made you a target, that you can never go home. I understand staying home meant dying or watching more people die. I chose different death, one where I control the timing. Bumpy smiled. Recognition, not warmth. You work for me now. You drive. You watch. You learn. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not act unless ordered. Frank nodded once. No negotiation. Both men understood refusal was not option. For 6 years, Frank became Bumpy's shadow. Drove to meetings, restaurants, social clubs where power got negotiated over cognac. Stood in corners watching how Bumpy read rooms. How he identified who held real authority versus who just made noise. How he used silence more effectively than threats. One night after Bumpy stared down 3 Italian enforcers until they left empty-handed, he delivered the lesson. Violence is expensive. Every trigger you pull creates consequences. Bodies bring police. Police bring federal attention. Bumpy poured cognac. Real power comes not from willingness to kill, but from making others believe you will kill without needing to prove it. Frank absorbed it. Watched Bumpy end conflicts through presence rather than action. But the most important lesson was the principle that became bedrock. We do not touch heroin. Bumpy's voice went morgue cold. We run numbers. We manage protection. We operate gambling. But we do not sell narcotics that turn human beings into shells who would trade their children for the next fix. Italian families make millions from heroin. Let them. That money is poison. I will put bullets in kneecaps of anyone who tries bringing it into Harlem. Frank nodded, understood, or appeared to. By 1967, Frank had become indispensable. Bumpy trusted him with information shared with no one else. 6 years of discipline and loyalty that never wavered. But trust requires verification, and Bumpy's network extended beyond what Frank calculated. Leslie Atkinson was Frank's cousin. Served in military intelligence during Korean War, stayed in Asia after discharge built networks across Thailand and Vietnam. When Frank reconnected with Leslie in 1960, he saw opportunity. Dead soldiers came home in coffins. Leslie coordinated in Thailand, paying military transport officers to look away and morticians to prepare bodies for dual purpose. Organs removed. Cavities filled with heroin packages. Coffins traveled through military channels that customs barely inspected. The plan was elegant and profitable. 40 kilograms monthly. 500,000 weekly. Jerome worked at JFK Airport Customs. Owed Bumpy a favor from years back when Bumpy kept Jerome's brother from getting his throat cut over gambling debts. Jerome repaid by reporting unusual cargo movements. When coffins started arriving with weights that did not match manifests, Jerome called Bumpy and described what he saw. Bumpy listened, asked questions, began connecting dots pointing directly at Frank. When Frank started building his heroin empire, Bumpy knew within 2 weeks. For 3 months, he watched, documented, gathered evidence for the moment when he would slide 3 photographs across a table and prove the student never understood the teacher controlled the entire board. Bumpy had another source inside Frank's operation. Someone close enough to attend meetings. Close enough to know shipment schedules. Close enough to photograph everything and deliver it to Bumpy before Frank knew the photographs existed. That source's identity would never be revealed because Bumpy protected his intelligence networks like generals protect reconnaissance units. Frank Lucas was brilliant, disciplined, capable of building an empire that would gross hundreds of millions. He learned everything Bumpy taught about reading rooms and controlling tempo and using silence as weapon. He absorbed 6 years of lessons about how power operates, but he violated the one principle Bumpy would kill to protect. He proved that intelligence without principle is just ambition waiting to consume everything it touches. That being chosen means nothing if you choose differently when the teacher stops watching. That trust once given can be withdrawn with surgical precision, leaving no room for negotiation. The chosen one became the exile. 6 years of loyalty dissolved in 3 photographs in 48 hours because Frank Lucas believed he could split the difference between principle and profit, while Bumpy Johnson proved that some lines cannot be crossed without losing everything. The fracture began in 1965 with envy disguised as ambition. Frank sat in a Brooklyn social club watching Carmine Tramunti count money that came from heroin moving through Italian family networks. Stacks of hundreds piled on the table like bricks building empires. Tramunti barely looked at the cash. Just nodded while his accountant tallied numbers that made Frank's weekly take from numbers and protection look like pocket change. $200,000. 1 week. 1 neighborhood. All from white powder that turned human beings into shells who would knife their own mothers for the next dose. Frank drove back to Harlem that night, calculating the mathematics of principle versus profit. Bumpy's operations grossed maybe $50,000 weekly across all activities. Respectable, sustainable. Built on community trust and services that did not destroy the people who paid for them. But the Italian families were pulling in 4 times that amount from heroin alone, and their empires grew while Harlem stayed contained by Bumpy's refusal to touch the one product that generated real wealth. The comparison gnawed at Frank like infection spreading through healthy tissue. He told himself it was not greed, it was pragmatism. Recognition that the world operated by different rules than the principles Bumpy clung to like religious doctrine. The Italian families got rich. Their children went to private schools. Their wives wore furs. Their power expanded across state lines while Bumpy's authority stayed locked within 20 blocks of Harlem because he refused to compromise on narcotics. Frank started asking himself dangerous questions. What if Bumpy was wrong? What if principle was just another word for limitation? What if the only difference between poverty and power was willingness to do what softer men called immoral? The rationalization built slowly, carefully, each brick of justification laid with precision that made the final structure look like logic rather than betrayal. November 1966, Leslie Atkinson came to New York on leave from his posting in Thailand. He met Frank at a bar in Queens far enough from Harlem that running into Bumpy's people was unlikely. Leslie looked different. Harder. The kind of hard that comes from years operating in places where violence is administrative rather than personal. "I have a proposal," Leslie said after the second drink. "Something that could make us both very wealthy if you have the stomach for it." Frank listened while Leslie outlined the infrastructure he built in Thailand. Military transport officers on payroll, morticians who prepared bodies with extra care, customs officials who processed coffins without opening them because who desecrates the honored dead, a pipeline from Southeast Asia to American soil that moved product with near zero risk because it traveled under flags and through channels designed for reverence, not inspection. "Dead soldiers come home in coffins," Leslie explained. His voice stayed flat, clinical. "We remove organs, fill cavities with packages, seal them back up. The coffins weigh what they should weigh, look like what they should look like. By the time they reach stateside, product is already past the hardest inspection points." Frank's stomach turned hearing it spoken aloud. Using American casualties as mules, turning grief into profit, violating remains of men who died believing they served something larger than themselves. The moral violation was profound enough that even Frank's growing hunger for wealth hesitated before it. "How much product per coffin?" Frank asked. The question itself was decision. Once you ask about capacity, you have already accepted the method. 15 kilograms average, sometimes 20 if the soldier was large enough. We are selective. We do not use every coffin, just enough to move volume without creating patterns that draw attention. Leslie ordered another drink. Current wholesale price for pure heroin is $10,000 per kilogram in Bangkok. Stateside it sells for $70,000 after cutting. You do the mathematics. Frank did the mathematics. 15 kilograms, $70,000 per. Over $1 million per coffin. Even accounting for costs, personnel, and distribution, the profit margin made legitimate business look like charity work. "What do you need from me?" Frank asked. "Distribution network stateside, someone who can move volume without attracting federal attention, someone with discipline and intelligence and connections that make product disappear into markets efficiently." Leslie looked at Frank directly. "Someone like you." The offer hung between them like a noose waiting for a neck. Frank knew what accepting meant. Knew it violated everything Bumpy taught him. Knew it crossed the one line Bumpy drew so firmly that even discussing it risked consequences measured in broken bones and shallow graves. But Frank also knew that Bumpy was 62 years old. That age would eventually claim what rivals could not. That when Bumpy died, his empire would fragment because it was built on personal authority rather than institutional structure. That the next generation would need wealth and power to survive in a world where Italian families controlled territories through money that came from exactly the product Bumpy refused to touch. "I need to think about it," Frank said. Leslie nodded. "Think quickly. I have other potential partners. You are my first choice because we are blood. But business is business. I move forward with or without you." Frank spent 2 weeks wrestling with decision that was already made the moment he asked about capacity. The internal debate was theater. Performance of conscience for an audience of one. He told himself he would keep the operation outside Harlem. That he would never bring heroin into the neighborhood Bumpy protected. That he could maintain geographic separation between principle and profit. The self-deception was masterful. Frank convinced himself he was respecting Bumpy's wishes while violating their spirit. That keeping poison out of Harlem specifically meant he was honoring the teaching even as he built empire on exactly what the teaching forbade. December 1966. Frank called Leslie and said yes. The first shipment arrived 3 weeks later. A coffin containing Army Specialist Robert Morrison, killed in action near Da Nang, returning home to family in the Bronx, who would never know their son's remains shared space with 15 kilograms of heroin, worth over $1 million on streets their son died believing he was protecting. The product moved through Frank's distribution network faster than he anticipated. Dealers who normally handled marijuana and cocaine jumped at opportunity to sell heroin that was purer than anything Italian families offered at prices that undercut their competition by 20%. Within a month, Frank's weekly gross tripled. Within 2 months, it quintupled. The money came so fast he needed 3 different accountants to manage cash flow through legitimate businesses that laundered profits into assets that could not be seized. Frank told himself he was building security, creating wealth that would protect him when Bumpy's era ended and new power structures emerged. He was smart enough to control it, disciplined enough to avoid the mistakes that destroyed other dealers who got high on their own supply or spent so conspicuously that federal attention became inevitable. But power does not accept gray areas, does not recognize geographic boundaries drawn by men trying to split the difference between principle and profit. The money Frank made in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens flowed back to Harlem. The dealers he recruited had connections that spread like cancer across neighborhoods regardless of what boundaries Frank pretended to maintain. The poison he promised would stay external metastasized through networks that connected everything, because in criminal enterprises there are no walls that money cannot penetrate. And Bumpy Johnson, who spent 40 years building intelligence networks that penetrated deeper than Frank's ambition could map, knew about all of it within 2 weeks. Knew and said nothing. Just watched, documented, waited for the moment when 3 photographs would prove that the student never understood the teacher saw everything and controlled the board completely. Frank believed he was building empire. He was actually constructing his own exile. And the countdown to 48 hours began the moment the first coffin arrived carrying heroin and the remains of a soldier who died, never knowing his sacrifice would be used to justify the exact corruption he thought he was fighting against. Bumpy Johnson did not react the moment he learned about Frank's betrayal. He did not confront, did not threaten, did not allow anger to dictate response. Instead, he did what he had done for 40 years when opponents made mistakes they believed were invisible. He watched. He documented. He built the case that would end not with violence, but with something far more devastating. Exile enforced through evidence so complete that denial became impossible. The intelligence came first from Jerome at JFK Customs in late December 1966. Jerome processed a coffin containing Army Specialist Robert Morrison with paperwork that indicated death in combat and return to family in the Bronx. Standard procedure. Routine handling. Except the weight listed on the manifest did not match the weight Jerome recorded when the coffin passed through his station. The discrepancy was small, 3 kilograms, easily explained as error in military record keeping. But Jerome had been reporting unusual cargo to Bumpy for 5 years. He knew that small discrepancies often indicated large problems. He called the number Bumpy gave him and described what he saw. Bumpy listened without interrupting, asked 3 questions. When did the coffin arrive? Where was it going? Who signed for transfer from military to civilian custody? Jerome provided answers to all 3. Bumpy thanked him and hung up. The next call went to Marcus, who worked the docks where cargo from military transports got transferred to domestic shipping. Marcus had eyes on every container that moved through his section. Bumpy asked him to watch for coffins. Note weights. Record who handled them. Report anything unusual. Within 2 weeks, Marcus called back. 3 more coffins. Same weight discrepancies. Same transfer patterns. Same funeral home in the Bronx receiving them. The pattern was forming. Someone was using military coffins to move products stateside. Bumpy made 6 more calls to people positioned throughout the supply chain. Customs agents, shipping clerks, funeral home employees. People who owed him favors or feared him enough that saying no was not an option they considered. Each call added another piece to the picture. Each piece pointed toward Frank Lucas. This reconstruction draws from historical records and testimony that became public through later federal investigations. The purpose is examination of intelligence methodology during this period, not instruction in surveillance techniques or criminal operations. By February 1967, Bumpy had confirmed what he suspected. Frank was moving heroin through military coffins. Leslie Atkinson coordinated in Thailand. Product traveled through channels designed for honored dead. Frank distributed through networks in Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. The operation was sophisticated, profitable, built on infrastructure that exploited both war casualties and the reverence that made inspecting coffins socially unacceptable. Bumpy could have ended it immediately, could have called Frank in and put bullets through his kneecaps as warning about violating the one principle that mattered more than loyalty or profit or 6 years of teaching. Could have made Frank disappear the way other men who betrayed him had disappeared into rivers or construction sites or places where bodies never got recovered. But Bumpy wanted something different. He wanted Frank to understand the depth of the betrayal. Wanted him to see that every move he made was visible. That the secrecy he believed protected him was illusion. That Bumpy controlled the board so completely that Frank's entire operation existed only because Bumpy allowed it to exist long enough to document it thoroughly. So Bumpy moved to step 2. Leverage. Not just information, but proof. Not just knowledge, but evidence that could not be denied or explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. He hired a photographer, professional who worked for cash and asked no questions. Gave him locations and times. Saigon. Bangkok. Bronx. The photographer traveled on Bumpy's dime and returned with images that told the story more completely than any testimony could. Leslie Atkinson beside military trucks. Warehouse in Bangkok with opened crates. Funeral home in Bronx with coffin showing packages being transferred to bags. 3 photographs. 3 locations. Complete documentation of the pipeline from source to distribution. Bumpy also collected names. Every person involved in Frank's operation, every dealer, every distributor, every middleman who touched product between arrival and street sale. He built dossiers, documented addresses, patterns, weaknesses, not for immediate action, for leverage. For the moment when Frank would need to understand that shutting down the operation was not suggestion, but requirement backed by information that made resistance futile. For 8 months, Bumpy watched Frank's empire grow, watched money flow. Watched heroin spread through neighborhoods Frank promised would stay clean. Watched the geographic boundaries Frank drew in his mind get violated by the reality that criminal enterprises do not respect imaginary lines drawn by men trying to split the difference between principle and profit. And Bumpy said nothing. Did not hint. Did not warn. Just collected evidence with the patience of a man who understood that perfect leverage required perfect information and perfect information required time. By October 1967, Bumpy had everything he needed. Photographs, names, shipping schedules, financial records obtained through people who had access Frank never knew existed. The documentation was complete, irrefutable. The kind of evidence that made denial pointless and resistance suicide. Now came step 3. Psychological confrontation, not with guns, not with threats. With truth so complete it left no room for negotiation or appeal. October 17th, 10:34 p.m., Small's Paradise. The private room where Bumpy had taught Frank so many lessons about power and control and the difference between authority and violence. The location was deliberate. The room held memories. 6 years of conversations. 6 years of trust being built through teaching that Frank was now about to learn he had violated completely. Bumpy sat with the manila envelope containing 3 photographs. Frank arrived thinking this was normal meeting, routine check-in, maybe discussion of operations or territory, or the 1,000 details that required attention in running criminal enterprise across 20 blocks of Harlem. Instead, Bumpy slid the envelope across the table and watched Frank's face drain to corpse color as he opened it and understood that every move he made for the past 8 months had been documented. That Bumpy knew everything. That the secrecy Frank believed protected him was Theater Bumpy allowed to continue only long enough to make this moment inescapable. "I have known for 3 months," Bumpy said. The lie was strategic. Let Frank believe the surveillance was recent. Let him think some mistakes were still hidden. The psychological impact was greater when the target believed some secrets remained even as the most important ones got revealed. The confrontation that followed was not negotiation. It was sentencing. 48 hours. Shut down everything. Leave Harlem. The terms were non-negotiable because Bumpy held every piece of leverage and Frank held nothing except the choice between compliance and consequences that would make compliance look merciful. Bumpy wanted Frank to see himself clearly, to understand that intelligence without principle is just ambition waiting to consume everything. That being chosen means nothing if you choose differently when authority stops watching. That trust once given and betrayed cannot be rebuilt through apology or explanation or promises about future behavior. The envelope, the photographs, the 48-hour deadline. These were not punishments. They were education. Final lesson about power delivered with surgical precision to a student who proved he learned technique without absorbing philosophy. Frank walked out of that room understanding he was being erased. Not through violence, through something more permanent. Exile from the only place that ever felt like home enforced by a teacher whose disappointment cut deeper than any blade could reach. Frank sat alone in that amber-lit room for 20 minutes after Bumpy left. The 3 photographs remained spread across the table, like autopsy reports documenting how his future just died. His hands shook so badly he had to press them flat against the mahogany to stop the tremors. 20 minutes where his mind calculated options that did not exist. He could run further than Harlem. Disappear into another city where Bumpy's reach did not extend. But Bumpy's network touched every major operation from Boston to Miami. Running meant looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, waiting for the moment when someone who owed Bumpy a favor decided to collect by putting bullets through Frank's kneecaps in an alley where screaming would not bring help. He could fight, gather his own people, the dealers and distributors who profited from his heroin pipeline. Turn this into a war where numbers might overcome Bumpy's authority. But Frank knew the mathematics of that conflict. Bumpy had 40 years of loyalty built through protecting Harlem when others wanted to exploit it. Frank had 8 months of profit built on poison. In any contest for community support, Frank would lose so thoroughly that his own people would probably deliver him to Bumpy gift-wrapped to avoid being associated with the losing side. He could beg, apologize, promise to shut down the operation and never touch heroin again. Prove through actions that he learned the lesson and deserved another chance. But Bumpy's face, when he slid that envelope across the table, held no negotiation. No mercy. Just the cold finality of a surgeon who already decided which organ cannot be saved and must be removed, regardless of how much the patient pleads for different outcome. Frank understood in those 20 minutes that Bumpy never made threats he did not intend to follow through on. Never drew lines he would not enforce. Never gave ultimatums that contained hidden room for compromise. 48 hours. Leave Harlem. The terms were absolute because Bumpy's principles were absolute, and Frank had violated the one principle Bumpy would kill to protect. So Frank made the only choice available. He stood, walked out of Small's paradise into Harlem night that suddenly felt foreign, hostile. The streets he thought he knew transformed into territory that no longer wanted him. Every face he passed seemed to carry judgment. Every shadow seemed to hide someone watching to ensure he followed orders. He went to his apartment, packed 2 suitcases, called Leslie and told him to shut down the entire pipeline immediately. No explanation, no discussion, just shut it down. Called his distributors and told them the operation was finished. Anyone caught moving product after 48 hours would answer to consequences Frank would not protect them from. By dawn, Frank Lucas had dismantled an empire that grossed $500,000 weekly. By noon, he was on a bus heading to New Jersey with everything he owned compressed into luggage that fit in the overhead rack. By sunset, he was gone from Harlem like he never existed, his name already becoming cautionary tale, whispered in corners about what happens when students betray teachers and ambition drowns principle. The geographic distance became moral chasm. Frank settled in Teaneck, close enough to see Manhattan skyline. Far enough that Bumpy's authority did not reach. He told himself this was temporary, that he was respecting Bumpy's wishes, that eventually he could return when tempers cooled and time softened the betrayal. But Harlem did not forgive, did not forget. The community that once saw Frank as Bumpy's chosen successor now saw him as the man who tried profiting from the one thing Bumpy forbade. His exile was not just physical, it was social, spiritual, complete erasure from the place that gave him identity. For 11 months, Frank stayed in Teaneck, worked legitimate job, lived quiet life. The money he made from heroin sat in accounts he could not touch without drawing attention. The empire he built existed only in memory, and the photographs Bumpy kept as evidence of why trust once broken cannot be rebuilt. Then July 7, 1968. Bumpy Johnson collapsed outside Wells Restaurant and died before the ambulance arrived. Heart attack. 62 years old. 4 decades of surviving violence and betrayal in wars that consumed weaker men ended by organ failure no intelligence network could prevent. The news reached Frank within hours. He sat in his Teaneck apartment staring at the television broadcasting reports about Bumpy's death and understood that the barrier keeping him from returning to heroin just vanished. Bumpy's authority was personal, built on reputation and relationships that died with him. The principle about Harlem not touching narcotics was Bumpy's principle. Without Bumpy to enforce it, the principle became suggestion that men motivated by profit would ignore. Frank made the decision that night. He would return to the business as Bumpy for bad. Not in Harlem. Bumpy's ghost still haunted those streets, but everywhere else, he would rebuild the empire on the same coffin pipeline, the same exploitation of war casualties, the same moral violations that made him wealthy before Bumpy discovered them and forced exile. The rationalization was simpler this time. Bumpy was gone. The old rules died with him. The new world belonged to men willing to do what previous generations called immoral. Frank had the connections, had the infrastructure, had the intelligence and discipline Bumpy taught him even if he rejected the principle Bumpy died protecting. Within 6 months, Frank Lucas was moving more heroin than he ever did before exile. Within a year, he controlled distribution across New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Within 2 years, he was grossing over $1 million daily from empire built on exactly what Bumpy Johnson spent his final years trying to keep out of communities that could not survive the poison. The student became the antithesis of the teacher. Everything Bumpy stood against, everything Bumpy warned him would corrupt not just communities but the men who profited from the corruption. Frank proved that intelligence without principle is just ambition that consumes everything, including the person wielding it. He built his empire on coffins, got rich from grief, turned American casualties into supply chain that funded lifestyle of mansions and cars and furs, and the conspicuous consumption that eventually drew federal attention. Bumpy always avoided through restraint. Frank never learned. The lesson Bumpy tried teaching with 3 photographs in 48 hours was this: some lines cannot be crossed without losing everything that made you worth choosing in the first place. That power built on betraying principle is just wealth waiting to collapse under its own corruption. Frank learned that lesson 9 years later when DEA kicked down his door and arrested him for running the largest heroin operation the federal government had ever dismantled. Learned it in prison when he realized that all the money he made could not buy back the respect he lost the night Bumpy slid an envelope across a table and proved that real power comes from what you refuse to compromise, not from what you are willing to sell. The countdown that began with 48 hours ended with life sentence and empire reduced to evidence in federal trial. The exile Bumpy enforced became permanent when Frank understood he could never return to Harlem, not because Bumpy forbade it, but because he had become everything Harlem learned to despise through Bumpy's teaching about what separates authority from exploitation. January 28, 1975. Federal agents kicked down Frank Lucas's door in Teaneck at dawn with warrants authorizing seizure of everything he built on coffins and corrupted principles. The DEA had been tracking his operation for 18 months. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants inside his distribution network who traded testimony for reduced sentences. The evidence filled courtrooms. The trial lasted 11 weeks. The verdict took 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. 70 years federal prison. No parole. The empire that grossed over $1 million daily collapsed into asset forfeiture and cooperation agreements where Frank traded names for time reduction. He gave federal prosecutors everyone. Dealers, distributors, corrupt officials. The entire infrastructure documented in testimony that sent dozens to prison and dismantled the largest heroin operation in American history. Frank served 7 years before cooperation earned early release. He walked out in 1982 into a world that had moved past him. The money was gone. The power was memory. The respect he thought wealth would buy had evaporated the moment handcuffs clicked shut, and he understood that everything Bumpy warned him about had manifested exactly as predicted. Bumpy Johnson died July 7, 1968, with his principles intact. He never touched heroin, never allowed it into Harlem while he had breath to prevent it, never compromised on the one thing that separated him from every other criminal enterprise that saw communities as resources to extract rather than relationships to protect. His funeral drew thousands, people who remembered how he kept money circulating locally, how he protected businesses from outside exploitation, how he proved that power could be built on something other than poison. Harlem remembered both men, but in radically different ways. Bumpy became legend, the king who protected his kingdom, the man who chose principle over profit when profit would have made him wealthier than any rival. Frank became cautionary tale, the student who betrayed the teacher, the man who chose money over meaning and lost both in pursuit of empire that collapsed under federal investigation. Bumpy avoided through 4 decades of strategic restraint. The old neighborhood never forgave Frank. When he returned to Harlem decades later, people who once called him Bumpy's heir crossed streets to avoid him. Store owners who once greeted him warmly now looked through him like he had become transparent. The exile Bumpy enforced in 1967 became permanent not through continued threat, but through community judgment that decided Frank violated something sacred and could never be welcomed back. In interviews late in his life, Frank admitted what he spent years denying. Bumpy was right. I thought I was smarter, thought I could control it, thought keeping heroin out of Harlem specifically meant I was honoring his teaching while building wealth everywhere else. I was wrong about all of it. He sat in a modest apartment in New Jersey, surrounded by none of the luxury his empire once afforded, and delivered the truth that came too late to matter. The money I made did not buy respect, did not buy loyalty, did not buy the one thing that actually matters in this life: the ability to look at yourself and know you stood for something beyond your own profit. Frank never returned to Harlem to live. Visited occasionally, walked streets that felt foreign despite being where he learned everything Bumpy taught about power and control and the difference between authority built on fear versus authority built on community trust. Each visit reminded him that geography is not just physical distance but moral chasm that cannot be crossed by men who chose wrong when choosing mattered. The lesson Bumpy tried teaching with 3 photographs in 48 hours finally penetrated, but only after federal prison and asset forfeiture, and decades living with knowledge that he built empire on exactly what destroyed communities rather than sustained them. The lesson was simple, but Frank needed 30 years to understand it fully. Real power is not what you build after your teacher dies. Real power is what you maintain when no one forces you to do right, when authority that kept you honest vanishes, and only internal principle remains to guide decisions between profit and integrity. That is the test. That is where character reveals itself through choices made in darkness when no witness exists except your own conscience. Bumpy Johnson passed that test every day for 40 years. Chose principle over profit. Chose community over empire. Chose to protect Harlem from the one thing that would have made him wealthiest because he understood that some money costs more than it pays. That wealth built on destroying lives ultimately destroys the person accumulating it. Frank Lucas failed that test the moment Bumpy's authority lifted and profit called louder than principle. He proved that everything Bumpy taught about intelligence and strategy in reading rooms meant nothing without the foundation of knowing what lines cannot be crossed, regardless of how much money waits on the other side. The new order established itself through this contrast. Bumpy died respected. Frank lived disgraced. Bumpy's legacy endured through stories about the king who protected his kingdom. Frank's legacy survived through warnings about students who betray teachers and ambition that consumes everything, including the ambitious. History recorded both men but judged them differently. One built power that outlasted his life through principle that community remembered and honored. The other built empire that collapsed into federal evidence and cooperation testimony that bought freedom but could never buy back respect lost through choosing money over meaning. The story ended the way Bumpy knew it would end when he slid that envelope across the table in 1967. Not with violence, not with revenge. Just with time proving that real power comes from what you refuse to compromise rather than what you are willing to sell. That principle is not limitation, but foundation. That the student who rejects the teacher's most important lesson learns it eventually through suffering that could have been avoided if pride had not drowned wisdom. Frank Lucas lived to 88. Died in 2019, surrounded by family, but never again welcomed in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson died at 62, but his name still carries weight in the neighborhood he protected from exactly what Frank profited from. The difference between those legacies is the difference between power built on principle and empire built on betrayal. One endures. The other becomes cautionary tale. And the lesson remains constant across generations. True power is not what you build when authority watches. It is what you maintain when no one forces you to do right, and only conscience guides the choice between profit and integrity. That is the new order. That is what survives when empires collapse and men who chose wrong face consequences they spent years believing they could avoid. The lesson is cold. The judgment is final. And history remembers not what you accumulated, but what you stood for when standing cost everything profit promised to provide. This story reminds us that real power isn't proven in loud moments, but in the quiet decisions no one applauds. Leadership is about drawing lines and having the courage to enforce them even when it costs you someone you once trusted. In life, there will be moments when success tempts you to compromise your principles. The question is, what line will you never cross even if no one is watching? Share your answer and where you're watching from below. This video is shared for historical reflection, not to promote wrongdoing. Thank you for watching until the end. If this resonated, please like, subscribe, and join us again in the next chapter.